Have you ever been struck by something you couldn't see? Not a stone, not a fist, not a knife, but a word. A single, sharp word that pierced straight through your chest, leaving no blood but a wound so deep it never quite healed. It happens more often than we admit. In a passing conversation, in a heated argument, in a careless moment of frustration. And long after the words are spoken, long after the voice is quiet, the wound remains. This is the unseen arrow. It leaves no scar on your skin, yet it shapes your heart, your memories, and sometimes your destiny. There's an old story of two childhood friends, Daniel and Michael. They grew up together in a small village, inseparable. They shared everything: dreams, secrets, reckless adventures. Until one evening, after a foolish quarrel over something neither of them would even remember a week later, Michael shouted at Daniel, "You're worthless. You've always been a burden. No one loves you." It was just a moment of anger, a harsh word thrown like a stone into a quiet pond. But for Daniel, the pond never stilled. That single sentence clung to him like a shadow, through his teenage years, into adulthood. No matter how many people praised him, no matter what he achieved, deep down he kept hearing it. "You're worthless, a burden, no one loves you." And Michael, he forgot he even said it. This is the tragedy of careless words. For the one who speaks, it's a fleeting burst of emotion. For the one who receives, it can become a lifelong burden. Why do words cut so deep? Why does a single cruel phrase sometimes linger longer than a broken bone or a faded scar? Buddhism teaches us that words are not just sounds. They're manifestations of thought, intention, and karma. In Buddhist philosophy, our actions are shaped by body, speech, and mind. What we do, what we say, and what we think. And of the three, speech is often the quickest to harm. Why? Because a word, once spoken, cannot be taken back. It travels through the air faster than a hand can strike or a mind can plan. The Buddha likened harsh words to arrows. He said, "An ill-spoken word wounds like an arrow, a cruel glance like a sword, and jealousy burns like fire." When an arrow leaves the bow, it's no longer in the archer's control. It will find its mark, whether the archer regrets it or not. And so it is with words. How often have we spoken something in anger or bitterness, only to wish moments later we could reel it back in? But the damage is already done. The arrow has flown. In ancient times, before empires rose and fell, before the wars we know from history books, words alone have started battles. A whisper of betrayal, a shout of defiance, a declaration of hatred. Words can make kings, topple cities, start revolutions, and heal nations. In your own life, they've built you and broken you more times than you realize. Consider this. You might not remember what someone did for you 5 years ago, but you'll remember what they said. The encouragement, the insult, the confession, the betrayal. Words have that kind of power. They enter our hearts and lodge themselves there, shaping our beliefs about who we are and how the world sees us. And yet we throw them around so carelessly. We speak without thought in moments of anger, jealousy, or boredom. We mock, we belittle, we lie, we gossip, as if words were weightless. But Buddhism reminds us that every word carries weight. A weight that presses down not only on the person who hears it, but also on the one who speaks it. In Buddhist practice, this is part of what we call karma of speech, or vakama. Your words leave ripples in the world. Some heal, some wound, some come back to you in ways you never expected. There's a teaching in the Dhammapada that says, "Speak only the speech that does not cause remorse, that does no harm to others." Such speech is truly noble. Simple advice, yet rarely followed. Why? Because we underestimate our own voices. We forget that our words hold the power to either burden someone for a lifetime or lift them from the depths of despair. There's a story in the Buddhist texts of a monk named Kassapa. He once faced cruel insults from villagers, yet remained silent. When asked why he didn't respond, he said, "A word spoken in anger is like throwing a burning coal with bare hands. It burns the one who throws it." And so, he chose not to pick up the coal. We too face this choice every day, in traffic, at home, in the comment sections of social media. Will we shoot unseen arrows into the hearts of others, or will we pause, knowing the damage we might cause? As you listen to this, maybe there's a word you regret having spoken, a harsh phrase you've carried from someone else. Maybe it's time to see these words for what they really are: weapons or tools for healing. Because in the end, a word can be both, a dagger or a bridge, a poison or a remedy, a curse or a blessing. The choice, as always, is ours. And perhaps the most dangerous arrows are the ones we don't even realize we've fired. Imagine for a moment a warrior in ancient times. He carries a sword at his side, its blade sharp, gleaming in the sun. He knows its weight. He feels its power. And with every swing, he understands the consequence: a life taken, a wound delivered, a future altered. But what if I told you there's a weapon far more dangerous than that sword? A weapon each of us wields daily, often without knowing it. A weapon that leaves no visible wound, yet has shattered more hearts, ended more lives, and started more wars than any blade in history. It's the tongue, the words we speak. In Buddhist tradition, it's said that a word cuts deeper than a sword because a sword can only wound the body, but words, they pierce the soul. You see, a sword's damage can heal. A scar may remain, but flesh repairs itself. Time mends bones, but a cruel word, a bitter insult, an accusation, a lie, a betrayal whispered in anger, those settle into the heart like shards of glass. They lodge themselves in the quiet corners of a person's mind, revisiting them at 2 a.m. when the world is silent and sleep feels distant. There's an ancient Buddhist proverb: "A word once spoken is like a stone thrown from a cliff. It cannot be called back. It travels, it strikes, and sometimes it kills not the body but the will to live." Have you ever noticed how the words that hurt you most weren't shouted by strangers but murmured by those you trusted? A parent, a lover, a friend. Because it's not the sharpness of the word but the closeness of the speaker that makes the wound so unbearable. In the Buddha's teachings, this is why right speech holds such importance in the Eightfold Path, the noble way to end suffering and attain peace. Right speech isn't just about avoiding lies or silence in gossip. It's about recognizing the immense, almost mystical power that language holds over the human heart. Speech has the power to birth hope, to forge friendships, to mend wounds thought incurable. But it also holds the power to destroy. There's a well-known story of a woman named Kisagatami. She lost her only child, a grief so unbearable it pushed her to madness. She carried the child's lifeless body through the streets, begging anyone for a medicine that could bring him back. Finally, someone directed her to the Buddha. He told her, "Fetch a mustard seed from a house where no one has ever lost a loved one." She knocked on every door, but every home had known loss. Through this, she learned that suffering is universal. But imagine for a moment if instead of compassion, someone had spoken cruelly to her. What if they said, "Why cling to a dead child? Move on." Would that woman have survived the weight of those words in her grief-stricken state? Or would they have pushed her beyond the edge of despair? That is the power of speech. A word can be a rope thrown to someone drowning, or the stone that pulls them under. And perhaps the cruelest words are those we dismiss as just being honest. We often disguise our harshness in the name of truth. But the Buddha taught that even truth must be spoken kindly, at the right time, with the right intention. "Speak the truth," he said, but do so gently and in a way that is beneficial. Because the purpose of truth is not to wound, but to awaken, not to belittle, but to uplift. Consider the world we live in today. Our words are no longer limited to face-to-face conversations. With a single tweet, a comment, a post, we can reach thousands. And yet, we often wield this power recklessly, forgetting that behind every screen is a heart just as fragile as our own. Have you ever read a cruel comment online that stuck with you for days, or seen someone's spirit crumble under public shaming? It's easy to dismiss it as just words. But remember, words have started wars. Words have ended empires. Words have led people to enlightenment and driven others to darkness. In Buddhist philosophy, this is why speech isn't considered separate from action. It is action. A harsh word spoken is no different from a blow struck. Both leave wounds. Both carry karma. Both ripple out into the world in ways we can't always predict. And yet, here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. The same mouth that can curse can also bless. The same voice that wounds can heal. The same word that destroys can save. A single phrase spoken at the right moment with sincerity can mend a heart, can ease a burden, can even pull someone back from the edge. Think of the times a gentle word from a friend, a teacher, or even a stranger brought you peace when you needed it most. Those words, too, travel with us, and they, too, are arrows, but ones made of light. So perhaps the real question is whether our words are weapons, but which kind we choose to wield. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how speech creates karma not just for others, but for ourselves. How every word we speak shapes the person we are becoming and the world we leave behind. Because every time you open your mouth, you're not just speaking to others, you're declaring to the universe who you are. And the echoes of those declarations never truly fade. They say a man becomes what he repeatedly does, but the Buddha taught something deeper, something quieter, yet infinitely more powerful. A person is also shaped by what they repeatedly speak, because words aren't just sounds passing through the air. They are intentions made visible, seeds scattered across the soil of the present, destined to bloom in the future for better or worse. In the great law of karma, every action carries a consequence, and speech, though weightless, leaves footprints as heavy as any deed. When we think of karma, we often picture physical actions, acts of generosity or violence or betrayal. But what most forget is that speech is action. Every word spoken is a karmic imprint, a thread added to the tapestry of our fate. There's a beautiful teaching in the Dhammapada that says, whatever a person frequently thinks and speaks, that he becomes. Not might become, will become. Because the tongue is not separate from the heart. The words we speak are reflections of the inner world we cultivate, and in turn, those words shape the world around us. Think about it. A child repeatedly told they're worthless will one day believe it. A community fed with hateful rhetoric begins to turn bitter and divided. A person who constantly speaks with envy becomes consumed by it. Conversely, one who speaks with kindness, encouragement, and wisdom not only transforms others, they transform themselves. Their mind becomes lighter, their spirit grows softer, their destiny alters course, because karma isn't fate, it's momentum, and every word we speak adds to that momentum. Have you ever met someone whose mere presence made you feel calm? Who, with just a few words, could lift a room or soothe an aching heart? That wasn't accidental. It was the result of years, perhaps lifetimes, spent cultivating the karma of gentle, wise speech. The Buddha often spoke of 4 kinds of speech to be mindful of: truthful speech, kind speech, speech spoken at the right time, speech spoken for the benefit of others. Any word lacking these qualities, he warned, creates karma that binds us deeper into suffering. Imagine you're standing at a crossroads, Every sentence you speak a step in one direction or another, toward bitterness, anger, and disconnection, or toward peace, wisdom, and compassion. The path is built in real time, word by word, and karma isn't delayed justice delivered in some future life alone. Its effects unfold in this very moment. Speak kindly to someone and watch how their face softens. Offer a cruel remark and see how their energy shifts. Notice how it changes you too. It's instantaneous. Like a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples reach back toward the thrower as well. There's an ancient Zen story of a monk who approached his master, troubled by his sharp tongue. "Master," he said, "my words often wound others, though I don't mean to." The master handed him a bag of nails and told him, "Each time you speak a harsh word, hammer a nail into that wall." Days turned to weeks. The wall filled with nails. Finally, the monk returned, ashamed. "I've hammered so many, master. What should I do now?" "Now," said the master, "remove one nail for every kind word you speak." The monk did so. But when he was finished, the wall remained pocked with holes. "You see," the master said, "words are like nails. You can remove them, but the marks remain." This, too, is karma. We live in a world addicted to speaking without consequence. Words fly faster than thought, sharpened by ego and carelessness. And in our age of digital communication, a single sentence can reach millions in seconds. But the law of karma remains indifferent to technology. Every word still carries weight. When you speak out of anger, you poison yourself first. When you lie, you carry the burden of that untruth in your own heart. When you humiliate, you fracture your own peace. And the echoes of those words, they don't vanish. They ripple through relationships, communities, generations. They shape reputations, create opportunities or barriers, and build the scaffolding of your own destiny. The Buddha taught that mindful speech isn't a restriction, it's liberation. To govern your words is to take back control of your karma, to plant seeds of wisdom, not weeds of regret. And here's the truth few acknowledge. Every wise person you admire, the sages, the masters, the healers, they all began by mastering their tongue. Because the path to wisdom isn't found in grand gestures or public displays, but in the quiet discipline of choosing your words, of asking before each sentence, is this true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And if it isn't, to let silence speak in your place. That's why the masters often speak so little. They understand that words carry karma, that even well-meaning speech can entangle if spoken carelessly. And the greatest wisdom sometimes lies not in speaking, but in knowing when to remain silent. As we journey forward, let's uncover what ancient teachings reveal about the hidden dangers of idle, reckless talk. Because while a word can build or destroy a life, it's often the casual, thoughtless conversations, the ones we dismiss as harmless, that leave the deepest scars. And if the karma of our words shapes destiny, we ought to know precisely what we're crafting. It doesn't begin with fists. It doesn't start with violence. It starts with a word, a single word sharp enough to slice trust, cold enough to freeze love, loud enough to awaken a sleeping ego. That's how conflict is born. Not in the battlefield, but in the mouth. Think about the last fight you witnessed or were part of. Did it start with a punch, or did it begin with a few poorly chosen words? Because words are the spark. And egos, they are dry leaves waiting to burn. A harsh joke wrapped in sarcasm. An accusation masked as concern. A careless word tossed like a stone into someone's heart. And then the silence breaks. Not with understanding, but with defense, retaliation, escalation. In Buddhist philosophy, anger is often described as a fire, but few realize the match that lights it is the tongue. In the Ida the Buddha said, "A person who speaks harshly will find themselves unloved, even when speaking the truth." Let that settle, because the truth, when spoken like a weapon, still wounds. Even facts can become violence when hurled with hatred. We often excuse ourselves by saying, "I was just being honest," as if truth gives us license to be cruel. But what we call honesty is often just the ego dressed up as virtue. Words have power not just to inform but to inflame. And in times of tension, the tongue becomes a blade sharper than any sword. This is how wars begin. Not just between nations, but in families, between lovers, within communities, inside ourselves. The Buddha warned of 4 kinds of speech that destroy harmony: lying, which shatters trust; divisive speech, which splits hearts; harsh speech, which bruises the soul; idle chatter, which drains meaning. Together, they form a poison that seeps into every relationship. But it's divisive speech that's most dangerous. It wears a clever disguise. It says, "Did you hear what she said about you?" It whispers, "I'm only telling you because I care." It plays the game of planting doubt, then stepping away as the fire spreads. And before long, 2 friends become strangers. A family becomes a battlefield. A mind once calm becomes restless with suspicion, all from a few words. We live in a world drowning in opinions, outrage, and debates, but very little wisdom, very little listening. So we defend our views as if they are sacred ground. We throw insults like grenades, convinced we're fighting for justice. But underneath it all, we're fighting to protect our pride. The Buddha knew this well. He was once insulted by a man who hurled verbal abuse at him. The Buddha simply listened patiently. When the man finally paused, confused by the lack of reaction, the Buddha said, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man replied, "To the one who offered it." And the Buddha smiled, "Then I do not accept your anger." This is the power of restraint, the wisdom of knowing that not every provocation deserves a reply. That silence in the right moment is mightier than any retort. But let's be honest. Most of us don't live like monks. We're human, we're hurt. And sometimes we strike back not with fists but with sharper words. So what can we do? First, we must see clearly that a word is never just a word. It's a force. A force that can heal or harm depending on the hand or heart that wields it. Second, we learn to pause, to breathe before speaking, because between the stimulus and the response there is a space. And in that space lies the choice not to turn our mouth into a weapon. Lastly, we ask ourselves, what am I really trying to protect? If it's truth, speak it gently. If it's pride, maybe it's better left unsaid. Because most conflict isn't born from real threats. It's born from the fear of being misunderstood, disrespected, unseen. And that fear often finds its voice in words that wound. So we fight, not for justice, but to be right. Not to connect, but to conquer. But what if we learn to speak like warriors of peace, with courage, but also compassion, with clarity, but never cruelty? Then maybe our words could become bridges, not bombs. Maybe conflict wouldn't be our default. Maybe the tongue, once a weapon, could become a tool for awakening. And in a world full of noise, a single word, spoken with mindfulness, might just become the beginning of peace. You see, a physical wound can heal. A cut on the skin may sting for a while, but over time the body mends itself. But the wounds left by words, they don't always fade. They linger, they echo, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime. We carry them in secret places no one else can see. And long after the moment has passed, the memory remains. As sharp, as cruel, as fresh as the day it was spoken. A careless insult from a parent, a cruel nickname at school, a lover's words spoken in anger, a betrayal from a friend clothed in sentences. It doesn't matter how many apologies follow. Some words leave scars. Let me tell you a story. There was a young boy named Kavi. Growing up in a small village surrounded by fields of rice and bamboo, he was gentle, soft-spoken, a dreamer, but he stuttered. And the children in his village, they were merciless. They called him names, mocked the way his words stumbled like stones on a path. Every day, their laughter was a knife. One evening, sitting beneath a bodhi tree, he asked his grandmother, "Why do they hate me?" And with ancient eyes, she replied, "They don't hate you, my child. They fear what's different." But those words, the cruel ones from his peers, followed him into adulthood. Even when he grew older, built a home, started a family, there were moments in the quiet when those old voices returned, mocking, doubting, wounding. Decades had passed, but the words had not, and so it is with many of us. The words we hear as children become the inner dialogue of our adult lives, a critical voice in the mind, a judge behind every failure, a whisper behind every success. You're not good enough. You'll never matter. Who do you think you are? It's not always the world holding us back. Sometimes it's a single sentence we believed at the wrong time. Even the Buddha faced this. Before his enlightenment under the bodhi tree, Mara, the personification of doubt and fear, did not attack with weapons. He attacked with words. He whispered, "Who do you think you are to seek truth? You are just a man, a fool chasing what cannot be grasped." It was not swords that threatened the Buddha's peace. It was the voice of doubt. But here's the wisdom. Words can wound, yes, but they can also heal. The same mouth that once spoke poison can learn to speak medicine. A kind word spoken at the right moment can erase years of cruelty. It can loosen the knots tied by old insults. In Buddhism, we call this right speech, not just refraining from harm, but actively offering words that uplift, words that mend, words that give life. The old story goes, a monk once scolded his novice for dropping a bowl. "Clumsy fool," he barked. The boy's face fell. For days he avoided the elder, until the abbot called them both. He asked the elder monk, "Can you recall how many kind words you've spoken to him?" The old monk couldn't. Then the abbot said softly, 1,000 kind words are undone by one cruel one. This is what we forget. It takes 100 gentle drops to fill a jar, but one crack to empty it. And so the world turns, bruised by tongues sharper than knives, scars forming in hearts we can't see. But imagine if, for one day, we each became healers, if every sentence we spoke was weighed before it was cast, not silencing ourselves, but choosing carefully, because if words have the power to wound, they also have the power to awaken. A simple "I'm proud of you," a quiet "I believe in you," a sincere "you matter." These are words that turn tides, that mend old breaks, that silence Mara's whisper. So maybe the greatest power we possess is not in how loud we can be, but in how gently we can speak. And when we do, perhaps the world itself will heal, one word at a time. You know, it's easy to talk. Words pour out of our mouths like water from a broken jar. We comment, we complain, we criticize, we gossip, we speak without a second thought, forgetting that each word is a seed, and every seed we plant in the heart of another will bloom, either as a flower or a thorn. But long before the world was obsessed with motivational quotes, before social media told us to be kind, the Buddha taught something far deeper. Right speech, not just talking nicely, not sugarcoating, not polite performance, but a conscious, mindful practice, a discipline of the tongue and the heart. The Buddha spoke of it as one of the Eightfold Path, the noble way that leads to liberation, a path that begins with how you use your voice, because the mouth is a gateway. It can open to let heaven through, or it can unleash hell. And what is right speech? The teachings are clear. It is to abstain from 4 kinds of harmful speech: false speech, lying; malicious speech, words that divide; Harsh speech, cruel or abusive words, idle chatter, gossip, and pointless talk, each of these in their own way, pulls the world a little further into chaos. When you lie, you fracture trust. When you speak to divide, you poison hearts against each other. When you use cruel words, you leave wounds invisible to the eye, but heavy on the soul. And when you waste words in pointless chatter, you numb your own awareness, missing the miracle of each passing moment. Right speech, then, is not silence, it's conscious speech. It asks, is what I'm about to say true? Is it beneficial? Is it timely? Is it kind? If your words fail these gates, they're better left unsaid. But this isn't about walking on eggshells or becoming timid. No, the practice of right speech is powerful. It teaches you how to wield language like a healer, not a butcher. It transforms ordinary conversation into acts of compassion. It turns casual remarks into seeds of wisdom. It reminds us that every time we open our mouths, we have the chance to either harm or heal. And here's the paradox: the one who practices right speech benefits even more than the one who hears it. Because by choosing your words carefully, you calm your own mind, you cultivate restraint, you sharpen awareness, you begin to notice how often speech is driven by ego, insecurity, fear, and pride. A story is told of a wise monk. Asked by a disciple, "Master, how can I know if my speech is wise?" The monk replied, "Before you speak, imagine your words are written on your own skin. Would you still say them? Imagine that. What if every cruel remark you threw left a mark not on others, but on you? Perhaps then we'd be slower to anger, quicker to kindness." You see, right speech is not some ancient moral code meant to suffocate us. It's a tool for inner peace. When you stop lying, you ease the burden of keeping track of your stories. When you refuse to gossip, you free yourself from the exhausting dance of opinions. When you avoid harsh words, you find your own heart grows softer. And when you release idle chatter, you make space for silence, where wisdom lives. This isn't always easy. In a world addicted to noise, to speaking without thought, to verbal battles on glowing screens, the practice of right speech makes you a rebel, a quiet, noble rebel, who chooses words like a sculptor chooses stone, not to wound, not to impress, but to build, to mend, to awaken. So ask yourself, as the sun rises tomorrow, before the first words leave your lips, will my words be a blessing or a burden? Because the world needs fewer voices shouting and more voices speaking like monks, like healers, like the wise. And the choice, as always, begins with you. There's a kind of wisdom that doesn't announce itself, a quiet strength that doesn't need to win arguments, prove a point, or leave the last word hanging in the air. In a world where voices clash like swords, silence is often mistaken for weakness, for avoidance, for indifference. But what if the greatest act of compassion is not what you say, but what you choose not to say? The old Zen masters understood this. They spoke when words could heal, and fell silent when speech would only stir more dust. Because sometimes silence carries a tenderness that no sentence ever could. Imagine a moment someone you love is drowning in grief. You reach for words, but nothing feels enough. No wisdom, no advice, no clever line to fix what's broken. And maybe it's because nothing is needed. Your presence, your quiet company, your unspoken understanding becomes the deepest language of all. The Buddha once taught, if you can't speak wisely, at least remain silent, not as a cop-out, but as a mindful offering, a way of saying, I choose not to add harm, not to add noise, not to feed the fire, because not every truth needs to be spoken. Not every opinion deserves air. Not every frustration must find a voice. There's a kind of cruelty that hides in words, dressed as honesty, I'm just being real. Someone had to say it. I speak my mind. But often that honesty is a shield for ego, a license to hurt under the guise of truth. Silence then becomes a discipline, a compassionate refusal to let the tongue become a weapon. You see, silence can protect. It can diffuse a fight before it begins. It can stop a rumor before it spreads. It can hold space for healing, when words would only reopen wounds. And here's the beautiful thing. Silence isn't empty. It's full of presence, full of awareness, full of humility. A Chinese proverb says, "A closed mouth gathers no feet," because how many times have we wished we could pull back a sentence the moment it left our lips? How many friendships, how many hearts have we bruised with words we later regretted? Silence offers us a moment's grace, a pause to ask, is this necessary? Is this kind? Is this mine to say? And sometimes the answer is no. In the monastery, young monks are often trained in periods of noble silence, days, even weeks, where no words are spoken. At first it feels suffocating, but slowly the mind quiets, the heart opens, and in that quiet, a new kind of communication is born, not through language, but through presence, through a glance, a gesture, a shared breath under the same ancient sky. You realize how many things words can't touch, and how beautiful it is to simply be, without the need to explain, defend, or fill the space. In this way, silence is not the absence of connection, but the deepest form of it. And when you master when to speak, and when to stay silent, your words, when they do come, carry weight. They land differently. They heal, not harm. They uplift, not divide. Because the one who knows silence also knows speech. So the next time anger rises, or the urge to snap back claws at your throat, remember this: you don't have to say it. You don't have to win the moment. You don't have to explain yourself to be at peace. Silence isn't surrender. It's choosing your battles wisely. And sometimes, the kindest, wisest, most powerful thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. Some words break hearts, and some mend them. In every conversation, in every casual remark, we hold a kind of power we often forget. The power to wound, or the power to heal. You see, the human heart isn't armored steel. It's soft, fragile, 1,000 invisible wounds walking around inside people you'll never see. And sometimes, one gentle word can reach a place no medicine ever could. A monk once said, "A kind word is like spring after a long winter. It melts the frost. It softens the brittle edges of a weary soul. It reminds someone, maybe for the first time in days, that they are still seen, still valued, still worthy of tenderness." Think about it. When was the last time someone's words genuinely lifted you? Not empty flattery, not polite small talk, but a sincere, warm thing said from the heart. Maybe it was as simple as, "I see how hard you're trying. You matter to me. You're stronger than you think." And in that moment, the heaviness eased, the storm inside you quieted, and the world, for a flicker of a second, felt kind again. That's the medicine of kind speech, and every one of us carries it. The Buddha called it right speech, a path of speaking in ways that are truthful, beneficial, and spoken with a loving heart, not just to avoid harm, but to actively sow goodness. Because the tongue isn't just a blade, it can be a balm. It can ease an anxious mind, mend a fractured friendship, or carry a grieving person one step closer to peace. And it isn't about grand, poetic declarations. Often, it's the small, unexpected words that change someone's day. "You did well. Thank you for being you. I'm here if you need me." Simple, sincere, enough to remind a person they are not invisible. In the old Zen stories, there's a saying, one word can give life, one word can take it away. A child grows strong under words of belief. A partner feels safe under words of trust. A stranger feels human again under words of kindness. And what's more, kind words don't just heal others. They heal the one who speaks them. Because when you choose compassion over cruelty, gentleness over sarcasm, you break the chain of harm. You become a light. In a world already too heavy with sharp tongues and cold hearts, there's a deep, ancient law in the universe. What you give, you keep. The kindness you offer plants seeds in you. The warmth you send out becomes the warmth you live in. And don't mistake kindness for weakness. It takes courage to be gentle. In a world that teaches us to be tough, to speak peace when others spit venom, to soothe when others sting. But those who master their words, who choose them with care, move through life differently. They're the ones people remember, the ones whose sentences echo in quiet hearts. Long after the conversation ends, she made me feel seen. He spoke to me like I mattered. And that is a kind of legacy no title or fortune can match. So when the world turns sharp, when the air feels thick with anger and haste, pause, offer something softer, a kind word to a stranger, a note of encouragement to a friend, a sincere thank you to someone overlooked. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real, because you never know. The sentence you say in passing might be the thread that holds someone together that day, and in doing so, you'll find your own heart softening too. Like sunlight reflecting back off the water you poured into another's empty cup. Kind words, small, free, but priceless. 1,000 arrows fly in this world. Be the one who sends healing. Once upon a time, words traveled slowly. They crossed from mouth to ear, from one soul to another, carried by breath, bound by presence. And if a word was cruel, it struck one person, in one place, in one fragile moment. But today, one careless word can circle the earth in seconds. We live in an age where every opinion is broadcast, every thought is shared, every judgment is typed, and once it's out there, it doesn't disappear, it multiplies. An insult posted online doesn't hit one person, it hits thousands. A single harsh comment becomes a ripple, a wave, a flood of anger. And what's terrifying is, most people don't even realize they're holding the bow. They type from behind screens, disconnected from the faces, the hearts, the wounds on the other side. A cruel joke, a mocking reply, a venomous review, and somewhere, a stranger's chest tightens. A young girl doubts her worth. A grieving parent reads a comment that slices deeper than the loss already did. In the old days, words died in the wind. Now they're immortalized in pixels. And the karma of speech, it moves faster than ever. The Buddha taught that unwholesome speech breeds endless suffering, not just for the one who hears it, but for the one who speaks it. And in this digital world, every word we send out is a seed that multiplies far beyond what our eyes can see. Because harshness begets harshness, anger sparks anger, and soon we live in a world saturated with noise, with bitterness, with venom, and people forget. They forget that every avatar, every username, belongs to a beating heart, a mother, a lonely boy, a teacher, a person barely holding on. We forget that silence is an option, that kindness is still possible, that even in the wilderness of social media, we can choose not to throw arrows. The platform doesn't matter. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. Words are still words, and the karmic law still holds. What you send out returns. You cannot outrun it by hiding behind a screen. You cannot dodge its echo, because the universe listens. And cruelty spoken in haste will one day be cruelty returned. But here's the beautiful part. So will compassion, a kind comment, a message of encouragement, a word that uplifts. It too multiplies, it too ripples outward. It too reaches places you'll never see. And in a world addicted to outrage, those who speak with gentleness are rare and therefore precious. There's a silent rebellion in choosing kindness, in refusing to join the chorus of insults, in turning away from petty arguments and leaving space for silence where another wound might have been. Imagine if every harsh comment was replaced with one of warmth. Imagine if every cruel meme was a word of comfort instead. Wouldn't the world soften? Wouldn't hearts unclench? Wouldn't people breathe a little easier? The truth is, you don't have to change the entire world. You just have to change your corner of it, your feed, your comment, your DM. And that alone can start a ripple you'll never fully measure. A monk once said, "Before you speak, let your words pass through 3 gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Today, maybe add a 4th. Would I still say this if I had to look them in the eyes? If not, maybe it's better left unsaid." And in that restraint, in that choice to step back from harm, you become something rare, a healer, in a digital age of wounds, a light in a landscape of shadows, and perhaps most of all, a reminder that in every era, no matter how modern, the old truths remain. Words matter, they always did, and always will. There's a kind of wound that leaves no blood, a cut so subtle, no one else can see it, no bandage covers it, no doctor treats it, and yet, it lingers, it shapes the way we carry ourselves, the way we trust, the way we love, the way we see the world. It's the arrow you never see coming, and most of the time, it's a word, a careless insult, a bitter remark, a mocking laugh in a fragile moment. We've all felt it, somewhere deep down. Words spoken years ago, and still, they echo. You remember the moment, the sting, the way your heart clenched, the way your breath caught, the way something inside you quietly believed it. And here's the truth most people avoid. We've not only been struck by these arrows, we've thrown them too, unthinking, in anger, in frustration, sometimes just to feel powerful, for a fleeting second. And every one of those moments matters because words aren't just sounds. They're seeds, and wherever they land, something grows. Harsh words plant fear, doubt, loneliness. Kind words plant hope, strength, peace. The Buddha knew this. He taught that right speech isn't just about avoiding lies or gossip. It's about understanding the weight of every word you release into the world. And if this series has revealed anything, it's that the world doesn't need more arrows. It needs healers, those rare souls who pause before speaking, who choose silence over cruelty, who wield words like medicine, not weapons. And you, yes, you have that power. Every moment, every conversation, every comment, every post. You can be the reason someone's day softens, the voice that reminds them they matter, the quiet kindness that stops a wound before it forms. And it's not about perfection. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about being awake, aware of the ripple you create. Because even if no one else sees it, the universe does, and so do you. So as we close this journey together, I ask you, when you speak today, will you send out an arrow or a blessing? The choice is yours. And in that small, simple, sacred choice, you shape not only your own karma, but the unseen, tender world around you. Speak wisely, speak kindly, and when in doubt, let your silence be a refuge. Because sometimes, the most compassionate sound is the one never spoken. And in that quiet, you might just hear something you've been chasing all along. Peace. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your words heal, and your heart remain light.